The morning sun had barely crested the treetops when I found myself kneeling on the hard-packed dirt floor of the converted tool shed, sweeping up stray bits of hay and detritus from yesterday's chores. It was an odd place to start the day, but ever since I refused to move into that senior community, this cramped outbuilding had become my domain of choice for quiet reflection. And apparently, for my daughter-in-law Jessica's commentary. She had breezed in just moments before, latte in hand, brows raised as if she'd stumbled onto some quaint but inadvisable museum exhibit. "The shed is perfectly fine for someone your age," she'd said, her voice laced with the practiced politeness of a real estate agent evaluating a fixer-upper. I'd smiled, nodded, and continued sweeping, careful not to let my calm show the tremor in my fingers. My age, 70, had suddenly become the most interesting feature of my identity to her. I could almost hear the implication hanging in the air. 70, too old to manage 15 acres. 70, too fragile to run a thriving bed and breakfast. 70, ripe for relocation. What she didn't know as she sipped that frothy concoction was that I'd been here before, both literally and figuratively. Nearly every inch of this property had passed beneath my hands at one time or another, from planting seeds in the herb garden to refinishing the hardwood floors in the farmhouse. I inhaled the cool, earthy smell of the shed, a scent that carried more memories than any scented candle she might gift me. The air was tinged with the distant aroma of coffee from the kitchen behind me, but the faint hum of the refrigerator was punctuated by a clarity I hadn't acknowledged in years. This place was mine. My name is Rose Mitchell, and until 18 months ago, I lived in a sprawling Victorian farmhouse that had been in my family for generations. It was a house with storybook porches, an original crown molding, a gourmet kitchen cousins would pinch themselves to find in a rural farmhouse, and sprawling grounds that drew guests from across 3 counties to stay in our B&B. My husband Frank and I built Meadowbrook Farm A together, pouring our hearts into every detail, from solar panels he insisted on to the winding creek where he'd fish on Sunday afternoons. Then Frank died, sudden heart attack at 72, and everything shifted. I was 68, newly widowed, and thrust into managing the contracts, the seasonal workers, the produce deliveries, and the bookings myself. I'll admit the house felt too quiet at night without his humming in the workshop or his terrible jokes at breakfast, but I never doubted my abilities. I tackled repairs I'd always left to him, learned to fix the temperamental water pump, and taught myself basic electrical work thanks to YouTube tutorials. The B&B thrived, $4,000 per weekend during peak season, plus steady sales of organic produce to upscale restaurants in the city. Our savings and his life insurance gave me a comfortable cushion. None of that mattered to Jessica. She and my son Marcus, my thoughtful, dutiful Marcus, had teamed up, under the guise of concern, to convince me to sell. First came the dinner visits. Marcus would fuss over my canning jars, then glance at the farmhouse staircase as if it were Mount Everest. Jessica would scroll through her phone, nodding at real estate listings and senior living brochures. "Mom, maybe we can find a place closer to town," they'd say, as if my little kingdom on rolling hills and ancient oaks was a burden I should gratefully shed. But today in the shed, I wasn't listening to their well-intentioned sounding concerns. I was listening to my own heartbeat, steady and strong, filing away the words in my mind like notes in a ledger. Someone my age, I was more capable now than I'd been in decades. I'd managed our household during hurricane-level storms, negotiated with demanding guests, and never missed a payment on a mortgage. Yet here I was, relegated to this dirt floor, while they measured the value of my home in potential profit. I finished sweeping, the pile of debris small but symbolic. I stood and dusted off my jeans, muscles remembering the routine. I paused at the doorway, looking out at the morning light filtering through the trees, the shed's rough-hewn walls framing the view of gardens I'd planted and tended for years. I could almost feel Frank's presence on that porch beyond, humming his tune, offering me another coffee. "Rose?" Jessica's voice drifted through the open doorway. "We thought we'd find you here." She set her latte down on a makeshift shelf, an old plank balanced on cinder blocks, and smiled that practiced smile. I stepped forward and picked up her cup, holding it by the base with one hand. The ceramic warmed my palm. "You know, Jess," I said slowly, "when I built this shed years ago, I never imagined it would be my refuge. But why don't you tell me what you really think?" Her smile wavered. She took a steadying breath. "I just think you deserve comfort, Mom. You could have a place that's safer, easier to maintain." I handed her the latte back, careful not to spill a drop. "I deserve what I've built. I deserve a place where my hands know every creak and groove." I pointed to the rough floor underfoot. "Even the sawdust and dirt have their place in my life. Do you know why?" She shook her head, lips pressed in a professional line. "Because everything worthwhile takes effort. You don't get to skip the work just because there are younger hands out there waiting to do it for you." I swept one last piece of straw from the doorway. This shed, the farmhouse, the gardens, they're all pieces of my story. You wouldn't understand until you've carried a life's work on your back. Marcus appeared behind her, brow furrowed. He stood quietly, arms folded, as though surveying a painting he'd been asked to critique. "Mom, we just want what's best for you." I met his gaze evenly. "Then help me decide for myself. I'm 70 and I'm running a 15-acre farm and B&B by choice, not by default. So if you're going to stick around, I expect you to treat me as the owner of this land, not as a relic past her prime." Jessica's eyes darted to Marcus. "We didn't mean to offend." I cut her off gently, but firmly. "Then don't." I turned on my heel and walked out of the shed, the morning light engulfing me. Behind me, they followed, lips parting and closing like fish out of water. I led them across the yard to the farmhouse kitchen, where their whispers would carry no weight. Inside, I set my straw broom against the wall and faced them at the old pine table where Frank once read the paper. "We have a lot to discuss, starting now." And with that, the real story began. My story, on my terms. I didn't wait for them to settle into the kitchen chairs before I began. The morning's confrontation had stripped away the veneer of polite concern and revealed the truth simmering beneath their thinly veiled interventions. Marcus hovered near the window, arms crossed, while Jessica perched at the corner of the table, her expression a mix of defensiveness and forced sincerity. "I want you both to understand exactly what you're dealing with," I said, folding my hands on the worn pine tabletop. "I've spent the last 18 months rebuilding this life. I've honored my husband's legacy, maintained every system in this house, managed every booking, and kept this farm thriving. I'm not blind to my age, but neither am I powerless." Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it again. I continued, watching him, measuring my words. "You came here under the guise of helping, but your actions tell a different story. You're measuring my home in dollar signs, handing me brochures instead of support, and orchestrating crises to prove your point. That ends today." Jessica's lips twitched. "Mom, we just—" "Don't finish that sentence," I said, and the icy calm in my voice made both of them pause. "You came here with a plan. You studied senior living facilities, scoped out luxury homes, polled contractors, and even sabotaged my utilities so I'd feel helpless. I have records of every outage, every dropped call, every missed delivery." She flushed, and Marcus looked away. I pressed on. Tom Bradley's sudden change of heart wasn't a coincidence. Mrs. Henderson's surprising arthritis wasn't a coincidence either. My internet and power issues, all of it pointed back to you two. Jessica's eyes narrowed. That's enough, I said. I won't stand here and have you pretend you care about my safety when you're after my money. Here's what happens now. I reached into a drawer and pulled out a crisp envelope stamped with my lawyer's insignia. Inside is a 30-day notice to vacate the cottage, month to month, with a 30-day termination clause. You have until the end of this month to gather your things and leave my property. Marcus took a step forward. Mom, you can't just kick us out. I can, I replied, sliding the notice across the table so that it stopped directly in front of him. Your lease grants me that right, but I'm giving you the courtesy of notice. Jessica's cheeks were streaked with anger. After everything we've done... After everything you've done, I corrected, voice steady. Now, before you spiral into excuses, understand this. I'm not spiteful. I'm protective. This property is mine. I built it with Frank. I've protected it from developers, preserved its soul, and shared it with honest guests who respected its heritage. You tried to fast-track its sale behind my back, contacting developers for nearly $6 million without my knowledge or consent. Her smile cracked, and she looked to Marcus for backup, but he didn't offer any. I pressed the advantage. Your financial struggles are no secret. You thought I'd be an easy mark, an elderly woman too frail to fight back. You gambled on that and lost. You'll leave by the deadline. Then I'll sell this place on my own terms, to a buyer who values its history. You can keep your $6 million dreams. A faint tremor ran through Jessica's frame. You can't do that. We could have helped you. Helped me by pocketing the profits, I said softly. No, thank you. I rose from the table and moved toward the window, gesturing at the orchard beyond. The late autumn sun painted the trees in gold and crimson, and a breeze stirred the leaves. This land deserves someone who loves it for what it is, not for what they can reap from it. Someone who understands that legacy is more than a payday. Marcus stepped forward finally, his voice low. Mom, we're sorry. We thought we were doing the right thing. We see now how wrong we were. I turned to face him squarely. Your apology changes nothing about the breach of trust. But I believe in fairness. If you vacate peacefully and leave this place in the condition you found it, minus the sabotaged systems, I'll consider not pursuing legal action for vandalism, fraud, and elder abuse. He swallowed hard. I understand. Jessica's defiance wavered. She looked from Marcus to me, uncertainty in her eyes. And what happens if we don't leave? I sighed, folding my arms. Then I call the sheriff, and you're forcibly removed. I file criminal charges for each act of sabotage and misrepresentation. I'll see your real estate licenses revoked. And Marcus, I'll report you to your financial services board. You pushed me to the brink. Don't make me go there. Silence fell. Only the ticking of the wall clock and the distant caw of a crow echoed through the kitchen. I stood tall, the weight of 70 years behind me, unbowed. Finally, Marcus nodded slowly. We'll pack up. I nodded back. Good. You'll have 30 days. After that, your cottage is mine to rent or to tear down, if I choose. But until then, you have a home here. Use it wisely. Jessica stood abruptly, grabbing her purse. This isn't over, she muttered. I didn't bother to respond. I watched them leave the kitchen and cross the yard toward the old dairy cottage, the envelope of the eviction notice clutched in Marcus's hand like a shareholder's proxy statement. When they were out of sight, I exhaled, the tension in my shoulders easing. I returned to the table and sat down, unfolding the farmer's journal Frank and I had kept. My hand found the fountain pen beside it, and I began notes for the coming weeks. Coordinate utilities inspection, confirm sale listings, schedule moving company, update insurance, every task a brick in the fortress I was rebuilding around my independence. As I wrote, sunlight spilled across the pages, illuminating decades of memories. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. They'd underestimated me at every turn, but they'd learned their lessons now. This house, these 15 acres, and this resilient spirit belonged to me, and anyone who challenged that would face the full force of my resolve. Outside, I could hear Jessica's voice as she and Marcus talked quietly over the crunch of gravel on the driveway. I imagined the words she used, bargaining, pleading, and I felt no pity. They had gambled with my home, and now they would pay the price. With a final stroke of my pen, I closed the journal and stood. There was much to do and little time. I would not just survive this ordeal, I would emerge stronger. And this property would stand a testament to a lesson they and anyone else would never forget. You don't bully a 70-year-old woman who's got a lifetime of grit under her belt.
The day after serving the eviction notice dawned crisp and clear, the fields frosted with early morning chill that glittered like sugar under the sun. I woke before dawn, as was my habit, and made my way outside in my robe to check on the greenhouse. The tomato plants had been trimmed back for winter, but the basil cuttings I'd rooted in water were thriving in their little pots. As I inspected them, I heard the rumble of an engine and recognized the delivery truck I'd arranged the night before. I stepped into my boots and jogged down the path to the gravel turnaround, where a new UPS driver hopped down to wheel out a package trolley. He waved, a courteous professional wave not unlike the ones I'd taught the old driver. "Morning, Mrs. Mitchell. New guy, Tyler. He sent me your way." I thanked him and took the small box marked Hermetic Water Pump Parts. It wasn't scheduled until next week, but I'd arranged an expedited order after Jessica's sabotage attempt on the well system. The technician who'd uncovered the vandalism advised I replace the controls entirely, and I wasn't taking any chances. "Thank you, Tyler. I appreciate the early delivery." "You're welcome, ma'am. Anything else you need, just call." He climbed back in and drove off, leaving me with the hum of vitality in my veins, independence secured one part at a time. Back inside, I brewed a strong pot of coffee and settled at my desk to draft an email to Tom Bradley. I wanted an apology, contractor's affirmation in writing, and confirmation that he'd only work for me again, no more corporate jobs. Within the hour, I heard his familiar pickup rolling up the drive. When he stepped onto the porch, hat in hand and an apologetic grin, I invited him in without hesitation. "Rose," he said, I sincere, "I'm sorry. After talking with my son, I realized what I'd done. They dingled big contracts and I froze. But you've been good to me all these years." I nodded, handing him the envelope with my lawyer's letterhead. "I need this signed. It simply states you'll continue servicing my property exclusively for the next 2 years, provided payment terms remain the same." He glanced at it, relief washing over his lined face. "Consider it done." He signed, and I handed him his copy. "Thank you, Tom. I need reliable help, nothing more, nothing less." Later in morning, I checked on Marcus and Jessica's progress. From the farmhouse window, I watched them hauling boxes and furniture down the driveway toward the cottage. Their faces were pale but determined, working in silence. I could see Jessica pausing to glance at the big maple tree by the barn where my husband had carved our initials decades ago, a silent plea in her posture. By midday, I convened a brief meeting in the kitchen, though there was little to discuss. I served them turkey sandwiches and offered filtered water while I laid out the terms one final time, as much for their clarity as for my own record. Marcus listened with head bowed. Jessica picked at the crusts. I reminded them gently, "You have until dusk in 30 days. I'll be overseeing the cottage utilities, so let me know if you encounter any issues." Jessica met my gaze. We understand. The rest of the afternoon I dedicated to tasks of preservation. I walked the perimeter with the listing agent's photographer, pointing out the best angles for the farmhouse, the creek's bend that caught the golden hour light, and the historic barn's peeling white paint that bespoke authenticity. I filled him in on the solar panels, the commercial-grade kitchen, and the acreage lines. By the time he packed up, I had high-resolution images on my laptop that would draw buyers who valued heritage over development. At twilight, I stoked the fireplace and sat with my ledger, tallying bookings still on the calendar. I contacted each guest due over the next 2 months, not to cancel, but to reassure them their reservation stood. Only the ownership would change. I could almost hear Frank's approving whistle. That night, I slept peacefully, no nightmares, no rustling doubts. The next morning, I awoke to a soft knock at the front door. When I opened it, Marcus stood there alone, coat buttoned to the throat, eyes red-rimmed. "Mom," he began, voice thick, "I have something to show you." I stepped aside to let him in. He closed the door and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a crumpled envelope. "I found this in my glove compartment," he said, smoothing it on the kitchen table. "It's Mom and Dad's wedding invitation. I was cleaning the car and discovered it under the seat." I recognized the creamy cardstock edged in gold, our 1976 wedding invitation. My heart hummed at the sight. "You kept this all these years?" He nodded. "I should have given it to you earlier, but I wanted to wait until the right moment." His gaze wavered, looking at the eviction notice still pinned on the bulletin board. "I'm sorry for everything I did, for hurting you, for being blind to what this place means. Can you forgive me?" I folded my hands over the invitation, feeling its weight and warmth. "Marcus, forgiveness isn't a checkbox. It's a process, but I appreciate this gesture." I slid the wedding invitation into my purse. "I'll take this with me when I move." He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Mom, if there's any way I can stay?" I shook my head, gentle but firm. "No, you need to learn to stand on your own. I gave you time to leave, and you're going to do it with dignity. Then we'll see what the future holds." He nodded, tears brimming. "I understand." That afternoon, I met with the senior community director in Florida via video call. I toured the floor plans, asked pointed questions about garden access, workshop availability, and guest accommodations for visiting friends. By evening, I placed a refundable deposit on a cottage overlooking a pond with a view south toward Maple's Gulf Coast. I'd arranged the move after closing. Back home, I updated my task list, finalized listing agreement, confirm Florida logistics, notarize my will revisions, and book the movers. I paused at the calendar, marking the eviction deadline. 30 days away. A grin touched my lips. 30 days to watch them scramble. 30 days to wrap up a legacy. Outside, the wind rustled autumn leaves across the yard, carrying with it a sense of closure and renewal. I inhaled deeply, appreciating the sharp chill. It reminded me that change, like the seasons, is inevitable, and sometimes the most beautiful things come only after the old ones fall away.
The week after listing the property felt surreal, as though I were watching my life from the vantage point of a passing train. Buyers toured the farmhouse and grounds, while I maintained my routines, tending the greenhouse at dawn, greeting delivery drivers in my robe, whipping up batches of granola for the B&B kitchen. Meanwhile, the cottage bustled with the quiet tension of eviction week 9 of 30. Through the haze of normalcy, I kept one eye on the slow unraveling of Marcus and Jessica's charade. One afternoon, as I pruned the rose arbor, I noticed Jessica emerge from the cottage, dressed in a crisp blouse and tailored slacks, her real estate uniform, no doubt. She carried a clipboard and paused under the old oak where I'd carved initials decades ago. I watched her lean forward, fingertips brushing the engraved letters almost reverently, and saw the flicker of conflict cross her face. I stilled my shears mid-snip, curious about her next move. Instead of retreating inside, she shook her blouse onto a low branch and slipped into an old sundress, one of mine from the seasonal swap I'd once offered her. I felt a pang of nostalgia as she smoothed the fabric on her shoulders. Her hair, usually pulled into a tight knot, fell loose around her collarbone, catching the sunlight in warm strands of chestnut. She glanced toward the farmhouse and took a slow breath, as if inhaling courage. I set down the pruning shears and walked toward her, deliberately clicking my boots on the gravel. She turned, surprise and shame flitting across her expression. "Mom," she began, voice catching in her throat. I found these." She held out the clipboard, and I closed the distance to glance at the papers pinned to it. Invoices, screenshots of my online bookings, notes on guest feedback, all compiled meticulously by her. "Interesting," I said. "You've been studying my business metrics now." I folded my arms, leaning against the oak's gnarled trunk. "Or were those research notes for your next spin at the property?" Her eyes watered. "I wanted to understand how you kept everything running. I thought if I learned your methods, I could help more effectively." I considered that explanation, weighing it against the weeks of covert maneuvers they'd pulled. "That may be," I said, "but it's not how help works. Help is offered, not gathered covertly." She swallowed hard. "I know. I'm sorry. I didn't want to hurt you." I brushed aside a stray twig from her clipboard. "This," I tapped the papers, "is just another in a long line of boundary violations. You're mining my hard work for your own ends, then playing the dutiful daughter-in-law when I catch you. That ends now." Her bottom lip quivered. I want to make amends, truly." "Prove it," I said, tipping my head toward the rose bushes. "These need pruning for winter, and I'll be turning the beds under soon. I could use an extra pair of hands." Her relief was palpable. She nodded and followed me into the garden, rolling up her sleeves. I handed her gloves and a pair of pruning shears. "Cut back the canes to just above a healthy bud," I instructed, demonstrating on a spindly stem. "Don't shy away. Roses like a firm guide." She copied my motion, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. I moved on to the next row of bushes, leaving her to work through the sunlit rows. As I dug bulbs for spring planting, I kept track of her progress from the corner of my eye. She didn't glance at her phone, nor did she snap photos. She was simply present, work-worn hands working alongside mine. By dusk, we'd shaped the arbor into a neat framework, the rose canes poised for winter's cold. Jessica leaned on her shears, breathing heavily, cheeks flushed. "I haven't done physical work like this since I was a kid," she said. "It feels right." I nodded. There's a rhythm to this land. It reveals your true intentions. If you mean well, you'll find purpose here. But if you mean to claim it, the land resists. She let that settle between us. When the sky turned lavender, I saw Marcus striding down the driveway, his hands full of cartons labeled dishes and linens. He halted at the edge of the garden and watched us, uncertainty on his face. I called to him, "Come help us load the truck." He huffed a small laugh, then slipped off his jacket and waded into the bulb beds, gingerly picking his way between the tulip's starting shoots. He scooped bulbs into a box, leaf litter falling like confetti around his boots. As dusk deepened, we worked in companionable silence, each of us focused on a task.
digging, pruning, packing. In a corner of the yard, two great oaks stood sentinel over the old well house where the sabotaged pump once lay broken. The replacement parts had arrived, and I'd summoned my new technician that morning to finish repairs. The well hummed behind me now, a steady promise of clean water and reliability. When the final box was loaded into the moving truck, I surveyed the scene. The neat rows of pruned roses, the stacked crates waiting for departure, and the golden light fading from the orchard. I felt a rare swell of satisfaction. The garden was ready for winter, the cottage nearly empty, and my boundaries reasserted. Marcus approached, wiping sweat from his brow. "Mom," he said quietly, "thank you for giving us this chance." I studied his earnest face. "Consider it a lesson," I replied. "Boundaries can be repaired if you respect them, but overstep and everything crumbles." He nodded, eyes glimmering with a mixture of regret and gratitude. Jessica joined us, and the three of us watched the truck pull away under a canopy of stars. Their silhouettes receded into the distance, small figures against the grand backdrop of my land. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table and poured myself a cup of tea, peppermint, my favorite for settling the mind. I opened the journal Frank and I had kept, turning to a page where he'd jotted a quote. "True stewardship is earned, not inherited." I traced the ink with my fingertip, savoring the truth in those words. Outside the window, moonlight bathed the orchard in a silver glow, and I could almost hear Frank's approving whisper on the night breeze. I closed the journal and stared into my teacup, steam curling like memory. The suspicion that had dogged me since their first polite visit had bloomed into clarity. Family means more than blood ties. It requires trust, respect, and honor. Tomorrow, I'd continue preparations for the sale and finalize details for Florida. But tonight, I'd let the garden's hush remind me of what truly mattered: the integrity of my own labor and the quiet power of a well-placed boundary. In the stillness, I felt both grief and relief, a duality I'd come to embrace. The homestead I built with love would pass to those who cherished it, and I would carry forward the lessons of the past into a new chapter. Usually I feared change, but here, beneath the moonlit roses, I welcomed it. Late winter swept in with its bracing winds, blanketing the lower fields in a soft sheen of frost each morning. The upstairs windows of the farmhouse rattled ever so slightly when the gales picked up, but inside I kept the hearth blazing. I'd instructed the selling agent to pause all showings until spring thaw. No point disrupting the place's natural charm with muddy boots scuffling through the front hall. Instead, I focused on closing details, reviewing buyer questionnaires, verifying soil tests, and vetting final offers. One afternoon, as pale sunlight slanted through the library windows, I heard an unexpected knock. I opened the door to find Mrs. Henderson, my 90-year-old neighbor from half a mile down the road, bundled in her shawl, cane in hand. Her eyes were bright, but concern flickered in the creases of her face. "Rose, dear," she said, offering her gloved hand, "I had to come by. I heard about the listing and the changes here. You know I care." I guided her inside, seating her beside the fire. "I'm so glad you came. I wanted you to have first pick of anything you'd like. Books, heirlooms, china, before the next owners move in." Her gaze drifted to the built-in shelves with rows of leather-bound volumes and family photographs. "I wouldn't presume," she said softly, voice quavering, "but if there's something you think I'd treasure—" I smiled. "It's yours." I rose and crossed to the shelves, selecting a small porcelain figurine of a garden fairy, one Frank had given me on our first spring at Meadowbrook. I handed it to her. Her eyes welled. "Thank you. This will be a treasure to remember you by." As she clutched the fairy to her chest, something shifted in me. Here was genuine affection,
untainted by gain or scheming. This was why I'd held onto my home as long as I did, for moments like this when community and kindness triumphed over family politics. After Mrs. Henderson departed with a small wicker basket of keepsakes, I walked through the empty guest rooms, their soft linens turned down and floral arrangements still fresh. I stopped at the window of the corner suite, imagining the Peterson family arriving in spring, children racing through these very halls, laughter echoing off the crown molding. I felt no regret, only confidence that the right caretakers would soon arrive.
That evening, I prepared a simple dinner. Roasted root vegetables from my winter stores, hearty bread, and a pot of herbal tea. As I set the table for one, I thought of Jessica and Marcus. They'd vacated the cottage weeks ago, moved into a modest rental in town, and begun new jobs. Their independence hard-earned. I found myself hoping they'd flourish without the crutch of inheritance. Halfway through dinner, my cell phone buzzed, a text from the senior community director in Florida. My chosen cottage overlooking the pond had become available for immediate move-in, and the final paperwork awaited my signature. I savored a forkful of carrot, then tapped back. Please email the documents. I'll review tonight. After dinner, I moved to the study and opened the PDF. The forms covered community rules, medical support options, and amenities. I paused at the section detailing garden plots available to residents. A slow smile curved my lips. I could still cultivate seedlings and share them with neighbors during Saturday socials. The community workshop would host my pottery class, and the book club would meet on the veranda. Change need not mean loss of identity. It could mean renewal. With the forms signed electronically, I stood and stretched, glancing at the oil painting of Frank above the mantel. His warm gaze seemed to approve. I poured myself another cup of tea and stepped onto the back porch, having the temperature dipped into the mid-30s. I wrapped my shawl tightly and watched the moon's reflection shimmer on the creek. In that hush, I allowed myself to feel the full arc of the journey. The shock of widowhood, the fuel of independence, the betrayal by my own kin, and the steadfast loyalty of true neighbors. The sense of isolation that had once pounded at my spirit was gone, replaced by the knowledge that home is not just a place, but a mosaic of relationships built on trust and mutual respect. A shooting star traced across the clear sky, and I whispered a silent toast to the future, one I would shape on my own terms. Tomorrow, I'd send off the final deposit for my Florida home and connect the moving company. Then I'd close the chapter on Meadowwood Farm, passing it into caring hands. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, tasting the crisp night air. Even in parting, I could honor what Frank and I had created here. And in the next chapter, I'd build something new, an intentional life rich with purpose, community, and peace. With that comforting thought, I returned inside, extinguished the lamp by the portrait, and climbed the stairs toward my empty guest room, ready to rest in the certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be, at the threshold of a new beginning.
A week before closing, the farmhouse stood quiet and waiting for its new owners. The wraparound porches were swept clean of fallen leaves, and the windows gleamed as though dressed in their Sunday best. I rose before dawn, as was my habit, and carried a thermos of coffee to the barn. There, I found my friend and longtime veterinarian, Dr. Elena Vargas, tending to the heritage chickens. "Elena," I greeted, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "Thank you for coming so early." She smiled warmly. "Wouldn't miss it. You know I love these birds almost as much as you do." Her gentle hands stroked a speckled hen's feathers as she administered vitamin drops. We watched the sunrise paint the pasture gold, and I said, I wanted you to have first pick of the animals. You offered to rehome one or two in your sanctuary. Alina shook her head. I'll take the little buff Orpington. She reminds me of my grandmother's pet hen when I was a girl. She rocked the hen gently and smiled. Thank you, Rose. My throat tightened. It's yours. Later that morning, I walked through the flower beds one last time. The autumn-planted tulip bulbs rested beneath the soil in neat rows, waiting for spring's return. I knelt by the cutting garden and clipped a handful of goldenrod to press into a journal page. Each stem was a memento of this place, proof that life, like fields rotated, cycles forward. Around noon, the moving crew arrived. They carried boxes labeled Grandfather's Tools, cookbooks, and photo albums. I directed them to the new truck, mindful of each item's cradle of memory. I slipped in among the movers, lifting a heavy wooden trunk. The weight was familiar, comforting even, as though the trunk itself knew it was going home with me. By mid-afternoon, the house was empty. I stood in the front doorway, framed by the carved oak doors, and let the wind tug gently at my hair. The farmhouse was silent, save for the distant hum of the well pump, fully restored, operating without a hitch. I closed my eyes, envisioning the Peterson family arriving soon to fill these walls with laughter and life. I drew in a deep breath, then walked the perimeter one last time. The creek sparkled where it curved around the lower meadow. The ancient oaks stood sentinel, and the outline of the old tool shed cast a long shadow across the yard. Where once my daughter-in-law had mocked its dirt floor, it now seemed to glow with testament to my resolve. At sunset, I met the Petersons for the final walkthrough. The mother, Karen, held her young daughter's hand as they tiptoed through the guest rooms. The father, Daniel, eyed the vegetable gardens and asked excited questions about heirloom tomatoes and pollinator plantings. Their teenage son, Marcus Jr., ran ahead to inspect the barn and clucked encouragement at the goats. Karen turned to me with tears glistening. You've created something beautiful here. We promise to honor its legacy. I looked into her eyes that saw the heart of the place rather than its market value. I know you will. After they departed, I followed the movers to the truck where the last box sat, Rose's keepsakes. I lifted it carefully, pausing as I slid it into the cab. Inside were my wedding invitation, the porcelain garden fairy, the Tuscan olive wood spoon Frank carved one Christmas, and my grandmother's tea set. These items carried the essence of my life story. That evening, I drove away from the farmhouse with the cab loaded only with the essentials. I passed beneath the weathered Meadowbrook farm sign, now slightly faded but still proud, and felt a pang of nostalgia. Yet alongside it was relief, the peace that comes from completing a journey with integrity intact. I followed the winding country road south, the setting sun painting clouds in fire and rose. When night fell, I checked into a quaint bed and breakfast halfway to Florida, tucked beneath live oaks draped in Spanish moss. In the parlor, a grandfather clock chimed, and I poured myself a glass of iced tea. A framed photograph on the mantel caught my eye. A smiling elderly couple standing under an arbor of climbing roses. I leaned forward. The woman bore a remarkable resemblance to me. The man looked like a younger Frank. A small plaque read, "The Johnsons' Autumn Retreat, established 1978. I sat back, stirred my tea, and murmured, "Then this B&B knows what matters." I sipped, tasting properties of home that transcended place. Before sleep claimed me, I journaled by lamplight. Today, I closed a chapter written in sweat, laughter, and tears. The land passes on, its next stewards chosen. I pass onward, carrying memories in my heart and keepsakes in my trunk. The future awaits, bright as spring's first bloom. Laying down, I embraced the quiet as comfort. Tomorrow, I'd continue toward my new home in Florida, where oak-shaded paths and pond-side porches beckoned. Tomorrow, I'd build a new community, plant new seeds, and nurture friendships untethered from expectations. And in that promise, I found both closure and beginning, entwined, like goldenrod clasped between journal pages, ready for spring. The drive to Florida stretched across 2 days, but I broke the journey into manageable legs, savoring small discoveries along the way. On the morning of the second day, I crossed the state line under a sky so vast and blue, it felt like a benediction. My heart fluttered with anticipation as I followed the winding roads toward Naples, where my new cottage and Whispering Palms senior community awaited. I arrived just before noon. The entrance road was lined with palms and magnolias, their glossy leaves whispering in the warm breeze. A stone sign reading Whispering Palms arched overhead, framed by flowering bougainville. I parked and stepped out, stretching muscles still stiff from months of manual labor. A woman in a sun hat and pastel cardigan approached, extending a hand. "You must be Mrs. Mitchell," she said, her southern accent gentle as molasses. "I'm Dorothy, the community director. Welcome home." Her smile was genuine, devoid of any agenda. She led me to a cream-colored cottage tucked beneath a canopy of mature live oaks draped in Spanish moss. Wisteria vines curled around the porch columns, their blossoms just hinting at spring. The door swung open to reveal a bright living room, furnished in soft neutrals and accented with botanical prints. "This is your sanctuary," Dorothy said, stepping aside. "We've prepared it just as you requested. A workshop space off the den, a potting bench on the rear porch, and a raised garden bed ready for your seedlings." I ran my hand over the smooth oak floor, breathing in the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings. "It's perfect," I said, genuinely moved. She showed me the guest bedroom for visiting family, then the library nook off the main hallway, where built-in shelves awaited my book collection. Finally, we toured the community gardens, rows of raised beds, a greenhouse, and a potluck pavilion strung with fairy lights. Neighbors waved from their plots, trowels in hand, exchanging friendly greetings. I signed the final paperwork, then Dorothy handed me a welcome packet filled with community maps, event schedules, and a roster of resident contacts. "Our first spring social is Saturday afternoon," she said. "I hope you'll share your gardening expertise." "I'd love to," I replied. After Dorothy departed, I sat on the porch swing sipping iced green tea and watching sunlight dapple through the moss-draped oaks. A pair of cardinals darted in and out of the wisteria, bright as little sparks. I closed my eyes and soaked in the sound of bird calls and distant laughter. I felt an unfamiliar lightness, as though stress were melting away. That afternoon, I unpacked my trunk of keepsakes. I arranged the porcelain fairy on the mantel, tucked my grandmother's tea set into a curio cabinet, and laid the wedding invitation on the coffee table. Each item felt like a talisman, linking my past to this new chapter. When I lifted the Tuscan olive wood spoon, memories of Christmas mornings with Frank warmed me like a hearth fire. Later, I wandered to the garden pavilion where a dozen residents had gathered. An elderly gentleman with silvery hair handed out steaming cups of lemonade. A circle of folding chairs held a mix of ages, some in wheelchairs, others with canes, all smiling warmly. A woman in a straw hat introduced herself as Marisol, head of the garden club. Rose Mitchell, welcome, she said, extending a trowel. We're about to start planting heirloom tomatoes. Would you like to join? I accepted, trowel in hand, and knelt beside her in the rich, loamy soil. As I scooped out a furrow, she chatted about their community farm-to-table initiative. Kids from the local elementary school visited weekly to learn about plants and pollinators. The tomatoes would garnish salads at potlucks and dinners in the clubhouse. I planted my first seedling, an indeterminate heirloom with deep red fruit, and felt a familiar thrill. This was my element, life sprouting beneath my fingers, tending roots to fruition. As the sun dipped low, we wiped our hands on our jeans and admired the neat row of young plants. Marisol patted my shoulder. "You'll fit right in." I smiled, warmth spreading through me. "Thank you. I'm already at home." Over the next week, I set a comfortable routine. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, followed by garden time, pruning bougainvillea, turning compost, inspecting seedlings. Midday, I tutored neighbors on seed starting techniques in the greenhouse, their keen faces reminding me of the students I had once tutored in botany at evening classes years ago. Afternoons found me in the workshop, shaping clay into bowls and vases, the pottery wheel humming beneath my hands. One afternoon, I received a surprise visit. Marcus and Jessica, cautiously polite, standing by my front gate. They'd driven down for the big move, they said, but also to see how I was doing. Marauding guilt must have driven them here, I thought, but I kept my expression neutral. "Mom," Marcus began, voice tentative, "we wanted to see your new place. It's beautiful." Jessica nodded, looking around as if absorbing each detail. "We're sorry again. This place, it suits you." I gestured towards the garden. "Would you like to help me plant these daffodil bulbs?" They exchanged glances, hesitation mingling with relief. Then, in unison, they nodded and crouched beside me. We worked in silence for a while, 3 generations connected by earth and forgiveness. The bulbs slid smoothly into the furrow, promise hidden beneath the soil. When we finished, I handed Marcus a garden glove. I said, "These may be your grandchildren's first daffodils next year." He smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "I'd like that." That evening, I hosted a casual dinner on the patio, roasted vegetables from my garden, grilled fish neighbors had brought, and crusty bread baked fresh this morning. The table smelled of basil and sea air. As twilight deepened, lanterns glowed and cicadas droned a lullaby. We sat together, laughter rippling across the table as Marcus described his new role at the accounting firm and Jessica spoke enthusiastically about her real estate projects, this time not tied to family schemes, but to clients who appreciated her honesty. They asked about my pottery, my garden club, my book club's upcoming Nancy Drew marathon, and I answered, feeling genuinely happy to share. At the end of the evening, as fireflies blinked among the branches, I stood and raised my glass. Thank you all for welcoming me, for helping me settle in, and for planting these bulbs beside me today. Here's to new beginnings and to the beautiful things we grow together. They raised their glasses, voices quiet with warmth. Hope bloomed in my chest, brighter than any daffodil. Later that night, I sat on my porch swing, the empty chair beside me, a comfortable space in case the Petersons or my neighbors stopped by. I closed my eyes, inhaled the jasmine-scented air, and whispered, "Home isn't a place. It's where you nurture life." In that moment, I understood the true legacy Frank and I had built. Not a farm to be sold, but a life rooted in resilience, community, and the ever-renewing cycle of growth. Morning light filtered through the wisteria-draped porch as I set out 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea on the small bistro table. Today marked 1 week since Marcus and Jessica's impromptu visit and their tentative participation in planting daffodils. I'd invited them back, not for reconciliation, but to witness the community's spring social later this afternoon.
I wanted them to see how a place rooted in mutual respect thrived, in contrast to the self-serving schemes they'd once plotted. They arrived in silence, Marcus driving and Jessica riding shotgun, both scanning the neat rows of raised beds where tomatoes, peppers, and herbs luxuriated in the morning warmth. I waved them toward the little table beneath the arbor. When they seated themselves, I slid a mug to each, the steam carrying the scent of honey and lemon. I settled opposite them. "Good morning." My tone was neutral, neither warm nor cold, just factual. "I thought you might like to join me before the social begins." Jessica wrapped her fingers around her mug. "Thank you, Mom." Her voice caught, as though pointing out the distance they'd created. I nodded. "You've done well here," I said, gesturing to the thriving garden. "Marisol and the club were delighted by your help last week." Marcus's eyes brightened. It felt good, working side by side with neighbors without expectations of profit. That's how community works. Mutual aid, shared goals, not schemes or sabotage. I paused to let the contrast sink in. "I want you to witness something." I stood and led them toward the greenhouse, where rows of seedlings basked in the humid warmth. Neighbors milled around folding tables laden with homemade jams, seed packets, and artisan soaps. Laughter bubbled as children chased butterflies among the flower beds. "I take a look," I said, stepping back. "This is what happens when people collaborate in good faith." Jessica watched a young boy offer a sprig of mint to an elderly neighbor who accepted it with a smile. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Marcus nodded, eyes moist. "I missed this. I missed genuine connection." I guided them to one of the jam tables, where Mrs. Alvarez, a retired chemist, stood by jars labeled blueberry lavender and peach ginger. I introduced Marcus and Jessica, and she offered each of them a taste. They accepted graciously, savoring the complex flavors born of patient experimentation. As they sampled jam, I slipped away to fetch something from my cottage. Moments later, I returned carrying 3 small handmade pots of basil, one for me, one for Marcus, one for Jessica. I placed them before us on a bench facing the community garden. "These are from my greenhouse," I said. "Basil Genovese, the original cuttings I rooted last winter. I wanted each of us to have one, as a symbol." I turned to Marcus. "Yours is for growth. May you cultivate your own life honestly." Then to Jessica. "Yours is for healing. May you mend the boundaries you once crossed." Finally, I touched the pot before me. "And mine is for resilience. May I continue to thrive through change." They accepted the pots with reverence. Jessica's fingers traced the vivid green leaves. Marcus exhaled softly. We remained there, the hum of the social around us, a living testament to what genuine stewardship creates. After a moment, I took my mug and rose. "I'll let you join the festivities. I think you'll find this community far richer than any inheritance you could have clawed from me." They nodded, understanding dawning in their expressions. I left them to mingle, exchanging polite smiles with neighbors as I walked back to the cottage to prepare for my own contribution to the potluck. Jars of rose-petal jelly, made from the arbor roses we'd pruned months ago. That evening, after the social ended, I found Marcus waiting by the garden gate. He held his basil pot to his chest. "Mom," he began, voice low, "thank you for showing us what community really means." I smiled. "You're welcome, but remember, community is earned every day through respect and integrity." He bowed his head. "I will." Jessica appeared beside him, holding her own basil. "I'm sorry for everything. I'd like to stay involved here, if you'll have me. I looked at her, then at the thriving garden behind us. I think you know the answer. I extended my hand. Welcome back. She took it, relief and gratitude shining in her eyes. As I watched them walk toward the last glow of lanterns strung among the trees, I felt a quiet pride. Part of me ached for the fractured bond we'd endured, but another part swelled with hope. They had learned, however late, that the truest inheritance is character grown like basil from seeds of honesty. Night fell, and I returned to the porch swing with my rose-petal jelly. I spread a dollop on a warm biscuit and listened to the distant laughter fade into memory. My phone chimed, a message from the Petersons, thrilled with their first harvest of spring onions and eager for gardening tips. I replied with instructions, then gazed at the basil on my windowsill, its leaves glistening in the moonlight. In that luminous moment, I knew our family story would continue, not as a saga of betrayal and property, but as a tale of renewal, forgiveness, and the enduring power of community. Morning arrived gentle and golden, the promise of a new day stretching across the lawns of whispering palms. I brewed a pot of rooibos tea and carried 2 cups to the porch, where I found Marcus watering the basil I'd gifted him last week. He looked up with a bright smile. "Morning, Mom," he greeted, his tone warm and easy now, free from past tensions. "Your basil is thriving. Mine, I might need more sun." I set a cup beside him. "Let's move it into that sunny window box today. It needs at least 6 hours of direct light." Jessica soon joined us, carrying her own pot. "I've been keeping mine by the greenhouse," she said, tracing a leaf with one finger. "It's responded well. Feels alive." "That's good," I replied. "Basil likes to be fussed over." I sipped my tea, savoring its gentle sweetness. The community was waking up around us. Neighbors emerged in gardening gloves, children gathered at the bus stop, and Dorothy, the director, waved from her golf cart. After they left, Marcus and Jessica stayed behind. Marcus wiped his hands on his jeans, setting his watering can aside. "Mom, I've been thinking," he began, hesitation shadowing his features, "about what you said, the inheritance of character, not land. I want to build something of my own, not just rely on what I once thought was guaranteed." I nodded, heart swelling with pride. "I'm glad. What did you have in mind?" He glanced toward Jessica, who squeezed his arm in silent encouragement. "I've started setting aside savings again. Tiny amounts at first, and I applied for a small business loan to help open an agricultural consultancy, helping other seniors start their own gardens or small-scale farms." I blinked away emotion. "That's wonderful, Marcus. You'll draw on your experience here, but it will be your own venture." He grinned. "Exactly. And Jessica's joining me. She's building a client base among new homeowners looking for sustainable landscaping." Jessica smiled, eyes bright. "I want to make sure I'm contributing honestly, and that I'm good at something I love, not just chasing commissions." "You'll both do well," I said. "You have work ethic and integrity now, earned through this community." As midday approached, I excused them so I could deliver my contribution to the weekly potluck, jars of rose-petal jelly. I filled a woven basket with 6 jars and walked to the pavilion, where long tables were draped in cheerful cloths. Neighbors greeted me with applause and requests for recipes. Later, as spring's warmth seeped into the afternoon, I returned home and found a letter in my mailbox. It bore the official seal of my former county's tax assessor. My palms tingled as I opened it. Inside was confirmation. The final property sale had closed, the deed transferred, and all taxes settled. Meadowbrook Farmy no longer belonged to me. I folded the letter slowly, absorbing the finality and freedom it represented. The past 16 months, widowhood, betrayal, battle, and renewal, culminated in this precise moment. I felt no regret for relinquishing the land. Rather, I honored the countless hours of stewardship by passing it to someone who revered it. That evening, Marcus and Jessica returned, hopeful faces framed by twilight. They joined me on the porch swing and we shared the tea I'd set aside. As we talked, the air filled with the scent of jasmine and honeysuckle from the garden below. "I received the letter today," I said quietly, handing it to them. "It's official." They read it, relief and pride mingling in their expressions. Marcus closed the letter and looked up. "Mom, thank you for giving us the chance to learn from you. You taught us more about family and integrity than any inheritance ever could." Jessica reached across and squeezed my hand. "And you showed us how to rebuild ourselves and our dreams." I leaned back, gazing at the soft glow of the community lights beckoning beyond the lawn. So now we all forge new paths. You with your business, me in this community, and the farm in caring hands. Marcus nodded. "We'll succeed, or fail, on our own merits, and we'll always carry the lessons you taught us." A breeze rippled through the jasmine vines, and I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. Family was not defined by blood or property, but by shared values and mutual respect. We sat in companionable silence as the moon climbed high, 3 generations united not by inheritance, but by choice. And in that choice, I found the truest legacy of all. Opening my journal that evening, I reflected on the past months, the confrontation, the evictions, the sale, and the move. I traced the ink across the page, then set my pen down and headed outside. The pond beside my cottage rippled in the moonlight, reflecting a sky heavy with stars. I carried a small lantern and walked the gravel path toward the community center, where the evening's pottery showcase was about to begin. In the workshop, my pieces glowed under soft lights, bowls shaped like petals, vases etched with vine patterns, and a series of 12 small cups, each adorned with a tiny basil leaf motif, an homage to the plants that had healed broken bonds. Neighbors murmured their admiration. I offered a short toast for resilience, for renewal, and for the hands that shape our stories. Clinking cups echoed softly. As the crowd dispersed, I felt a familiar presence at my elbow. It was Marcus, eyes shining with pride. "Mom, these are incredible. Each piece tells a story." I smiled, "Just as you're writing yours." He glanced around, then asked, "Would you consider teaching a pottery class here?" I paused, the idea both thrilling and rooted in nostalgia. "I would like that." The next day, I drafted a syllabus: beginner wheelwork, hand building, glazing techniques, and story-driven design. I pitched it at the Residence Council, and they approved my weekly evening class. Thus began the first chapter of my new vocation, guiding others to shape clay with their hands and their hearts. Students arrived with eager faces, and I witnessed the same spark in their eyes that I'd once seen in my own grandchildren when I told them stories at bedtime. Meanwhile, Marcus and Jessica's business venture took root. Their first client was an elderly widow needing raised vegetable beds. They worked together, measuring plots, ordering materials, and finally installing beds that sat low and sturdy, accessible, dignified, and practical. Watching them interact with their client, I saw their genuine delight in helping, unmarred by ulterior motives. One afternoon, I visited their project site unannounced. Jessica polished off the final board as Marcus steadied the bench. They looked up, startled, then beamed. "Mom!" they exclaimed. I just wanted to see. I surveyed their work, crisp lines, level soil, and a small sign reading Mitchell and Carter, Sustainable Solutions. Jessica's eyes flickered with emotion. "We named it for you." I pressed my hand to my heart. Thank you. That evening at home, I sat by my window, drinking tea and gazing at the pottery tools I'd left on the table. I penned a new journal entry. Life molds us through trials and choices. Today, I teach at the wheel and witness my children craft their own lives. Our stories converge in clay, soil, and shared purpose. The wind stirred the jasmine, and I felt the threads of past and present weaving into a tapestry rich with possibility.
I woke before dawn, as though the hours before sunrise held some unique clarity, and made my way to the den where my laptop glowed on the desk. With a steaming mug of green tea in hand, I opened the secure email from Whitlock and Pierce, the private investigation firm I'd retained on a hunch. My heart quickened as I clicked the PDF attachment titled Client Report, Mitchell Estate Inquiry. The first section laid out my son's and daughter-in-law's financial profiles in stark terms. Foreclosure proceedings initiated last spring. Second mortgage taken out 18 months ago with my property listed as repayment collateral. Credit card balances carrying interest rates above 20% and a repossessed vehicle. Each bullet point was accompanied by public record citations and scanned documents. I leaned back in my chair, tea forgotten in my hand, as the implications settled in my mind. They'd gambled on my death before I even knew to guard against it. I scrolled to the next section, communications logs. There were dates, phone numbers, and call transcripts showing Jessica in contact with at least 3 separate development companies over the past year. One transcript from October revealed her stating, "I'm authorized to share aerial surveys and zoning maps on behalf of Mrs. Mitchell." Her tone was professional, clipped, and entirely false. My stomach churned. She was representing me without my knowledge, planting the seeds for a sale behind the scenes. I sipped my tea, now lukewarm, and steeled myself for the final section, witness interviews. The PI had interviewed Tom Bradley's teenage son, clandestinely recorded under state law. The transcript captured the boy's reluctant confession. Mr. Marcus said if Dad kept working at that old farm, there'd be no deal for the commercial contract. So Dad did what he had to do. My contractor, bribed, to abandon me. The cruelty of it took my breath away. I closed the laptop and pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the den's window, looking out at the magnolia tree in bloom. For a moment, I let the fragrant sweetness soothe me, reminding myself that knowledge is power, and I had plenty of both. By sunrise, I'd drafted a plan of action. First, a call to my lawyer, Richard. Second, a carefully worded letter to the development firms rescinding any authorization Jessica might have claimed. Third, preparation of a civil complaint for elder abuse and fraud, just in case they opted to ignore the 30-day eviction notice. Fourth, an affidavit outlining the PI's findings, ready to file in court if necessary. I dialed Richard's direct line and rattled off the highlights. He was sympathetic but pragmatic. "Rose, this is textbook fraud and elder exploitation. You have more than enough evidence. But if you're aiming to avoid public litigation and simply ensure they never return, we can file a limited protective order and a notice of intent to sue. That alone will keep them at bay." I agreed. I didn't want to drag my son through a courtroom if I could help it. I wanted boundaries enforced, not family blood spilled. Next, I composed 2 separate letters on Richard's letterhead. The first went to Whitfield and Associates and 2 other development companies, informing them that Jessica Carter was not authorized to represent me, that any agreements made in her name were null and void, and that further inquiries must come directly from me. The second letter went to the local court clerk, with Richard's assistance, a notice of intention to file civil charges for fraudulent misrepresentation and elder abuse, with a 10-day window to negotiate a settlement if they vacated without further incident. After sending the emails, I exhaled and walked into the kitchen to prepare breakfast. My hands moved with practiced efficiency, whisking eggs, toasting sourdough, brewing more tea, but my mind churned through scenarios. Would Jessica and Marcus sue me back? Would they comply quietly? I resolved to keep my eyes on the bigger picture. My peace, my new life, and the trust I'd rebuilt with honest neighbors here in Florida. By breakfast, the replies came in. Whitfield and Associates acknowledged receipt and confirmed they were removing my property from their development listings. The second firm was more brusque, but agreed once they verified my attorney's instructions. I taped the acknowledgments to the den's bulletin board like trophies. It felt good to see my legal muscles flexed. That afternoon, I prepared affidavits for the court filing, one from myself, detailing the timeline of sabotage, one from the well technician who'd confirmed malicious damage, one from Tom Bradley's son, who'd corroborated the contractor's coercion, and one from Mrs. Henderson, whose daily visits had abruptly ended. Each witness attested to their observations, lending weight to the case without resorting to sensational language. By dusk, all documents were in Richard's hands. He estimated that the court clerk could issue the protective order within 72 hours. That night, I slept soundly. No nightmares, only a flutter of anticipation for the sunrise, when the order would formally block any attempt by Jessica or Marcus to contact me or return to the property. The next morning, I received a call from the clerk's office. The protective order was granted. I logged into the secure state portal and downloaded the order. Its language was firm. Jessica Carter and Marcus Mitchell are hereby restrained from contacting, representing, or approaching the undersigned, Rose Mitchell, and from entering any property associated with her residence or business operations. I printed multiple certified copies, one for my files, one for my lawyer, and one for the local sheriff's office, just in case. I felt a surge of liberation. No more covert calls from developers, no more third-party conspiracies. The boundaries I had set, physical, legal, and emotional, were now backed by the full force of the law. I spent the rest of the morning arranging for the order to be formally served on them via certified mail. As I sipped mid-morning tea on the porch, I watched a blue jay flit through the azalea bushes. Its bright feathers reminded me of the flash of independence that had ignited in me those months ago. The private investigation had confirmed worst fears, but it had also given me the evidence to protect myself and move forward. That evening, I locked up the den and returned to my pottery workshop. I wedged a fresh lump of clay on the wheel, firm, unyielding, but ready to reshape under the right hands. I thought of Jessica and Marcus, their debts and schemes now laid bare, and offered a silent toast to truth, clarity, and the unbreakable boundary between respect and exploitation. As the wheels spun and my hands coaxed the clay into form, I felt the final shreds of doubt and resentment wash away. I was author of my own life, and no one could rewrite it without my consent. Here in this Florida community of shared gardens and honest transactions, I was exactly where I belonged. Safe, respected, and free. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of my Florida cottage as I settled into my new routine. Morning tea on the porch, a quick round of emails, then a session at the pottery wheel. But today's priority lay elsewhere, finalizing my personal and legal affairs for this next chapter. After yesterday's triumph securing the protective order, I felt compelled to shore up every remaining perimeter of my life against unforeseen storms. I made my way to the small, study alcove off the living room, where a mahogany desk stood beneath framed botanical prints. On one side lay the leather-bound journal Frank and I had kept. On the other, a stack of unopened envelopes from the community's legal aid clinic. I poured myself a cup of mint tea and began sorting the correspondence. First on the agenda was updating my will and estate plan. Over the years, I had added codicils as family events unfolded, children's births, the farmhouse renovations, the B&B's incorporation, and now those documents needed a thorough overhaul. I dialed my attorney Richard's number and left a message requesting an appointment at his Naples office within the week. With the protective order in place against Marcus and Jessica, I felt a certain freedom to redefine beneficiaries without concern for their interference. Next, I turned to healthcare directives. I retrieved the packet the clinic had sent, a living will form, power of attorney for healthcare, and a HIPAA release specifying which loved ones and professionals could access my medical records. I filled in Dr. Elena Vargas as my primary healthcare agent, trusting her decades of familiarity with my needs and her integrity. I designated my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, as alternate agent and included Dorothy, the community director, as a tertiary contact to ensure I always had supportive advocates nearby. With the living will section in hand, I detailed my preferences: comfort-focused care, maximal mobility, and clear directives against overly aggressive interventions. I dated and signed each page, then placed them in the envelope addressed to the county clerk for notarization. I scheduled a mobile notary visit through the community's concierge service. Residents could request a notary to come to the cottage, saving a trip into town. Satisfied, I reviewed my insurance policies. The homeowner's policy on the Florida cottage required an updated replacement cost inventory. I wandered through each room, living room, den, kitchen, studio, and photographed furniture, art, and personal belongings. I logged each item in a spreadsheet: date acquired, estimated value, and condition. In the pottery studio, I included photographs of my wheel, kiln manual, glaze collection, and favorite tools. This inventory, I knew, was more than paperwork. It was a ledger of memory and toil. Around mid-morning, the notary arrived in golf cart uniform. We sat at my kitchen table, tea and crackers laid out as a courtesy. She swore me in, witnessed my signatures, and stamped the documents. She said everything looks in order, handing me 2 copies, one for my files, one for the clerk. I tucked them into a bright folder labeled Vital Records. Before she left, I asked about community trust services. The concierge directed me to Ms. Patel, a financial planner who held monthly office hours at the clubhouse. I called and scheduled a meeting for tomorrow afternoon to discuss establishing a small revocable trust for my remaining assets, including the proceeds now safely deposited in a local credit union. A trust would streamline any future transitions and spare heirs' probate delays. After the notary departed, I spent the afternoon drafting an update for my B&B website, now a portfolio piece rather than an active business. I wrote a post titled Reflections on Meadowbrook, Lessons in Legacy, recounting, in broad strokes, how stewardship and boundaries shaped my path. I published it to my personal blog and shared the link with community newsletters. It felt cathartic to put these lessons into words, hoping they might guide others facing similar crossroads. Late afternoon found me in the greenhouse inspecting seedlings of heirloom carrots and rainbow chard destined for the spring community garden. As I pruned the basil that had spawned from last week's planting, my phone buzzed with a reminder: 2 p.m., trust consultation with Miss Patel.
I washed my hands and headed to the clubhouse, where Miss Patel greeted me in a sunlit conference room lined with potted ferns. We discussed the nuts and bolts of a revocable living trust, naming myself as trustee with my attorney Richard as successor trustee, funding the trust with my bank accounts and personal property, and specifying distribution guidelines for any beneficiaries I chose to include: longtime friends, the community garden club, and a charitable endowment for elderly wellness programs. We also reviewed the protective order's implications, ensuring the trust's assets could not be diverted by someone under legal restraint. By 4 p.m., the trust documents were drafted, ready for my review. Ms. Patel emailed me a PDF, and I agreed to meet with Richard next week to execute them. I left the clubhouse feeling an encompassing sense of order, my legacy, my care preferences, and my assets all aligned under clear, enforceable structures. Back at home, I returned to the pottery studio and wedged a fresh batch of clay on the wheel. The day's administrative labors gave way to a different rhythm, wet clay spinning under my hands, coaxed into a wide bowl shape. As I trimmed the foot and lifted the walls, I thought of the legal safeguards I'd put in place: the protective order, the living will, the trust. Each acted as a boundary, a vessel to hold my life's richness without risk of undue intrusion. When the wheels slowed, I placed the bowl on the drying rack, its curves catching the soft glow of dusk. I wiped my hands on my apron and headed to the porch, where the evening air carried the scent of jasmine and distant laughter from the potluck pavilion. Marcus and Jessica appeared carrying 2 bottles of wine, one white, one red, as though reading my mind. I invited them to sit on the swing, and we toasted to new beginnings and well-placed boundaries. The corks popped softly under the starlit sky. Jessica sipped and closed her eyes appreciatively. She said, "It's good. Here, everything feels intentional." Marcus nodded. "You've shown us how to build life and legacy with purpose." I smiled, lifting my glass to the moon, and now I continued to build mine with clarity and peace of mind. We sat together in companionable silence, the trust documents, living will, and protective order secure in my files, and the clay bowl drying in the studio, a testament that, just like pottery, a well-lived life requires both structure and patience, resilience and grace. Spring unfolded like a watercolor painting, each day adding fresh strokes of green and petals that brushed the sky in pastel hues. My morning routine remained sacred: tea on the porch, a walk through the community garden, then a session at the pottery wheel. Today, however, I had a special task. I'd been invited to judge the annual Heritage Harvest exhibit at the community center, a showcase of heirloom vegetables, floral arrangements, and historical narratives from senior residents. It was the perfect opportunity to blend my farming roots and storytelling passion. By mid-morning, I arrived at the pavilion, greeted by a table heaped with buttercup squash, marble-eyed potatoes, and bunched radishes, whose roots curled like little scrolls of parchment. Neighbors bustled, adjusting name cards and wiping condensation from jars of pickled beets. Dorothy welcomed me warmly and handed a clipboard with judging criteria: authenticity of heirloom variety, presentation, story of provenance. I began with the vegetables. A robust butternut squash sat on a lace doily accompanied by a handwritten note: grown from seed, passed down from my grandmother's farm in Vermont, 1903. The squash's smooth rind glowed orange gold. I jotted notes: vibrant color, exceptional size, compelling lineage. Next was a basket of fingerling potatoes in mottled purple and cream. Their exhibitor, Mr. Chen, explained he'd saved the tubers from a bandit potato variety first brought over by Chinese railroad workers. The story gave weight to the earthy flavor in each bite I sampled. I recorded cultural significance, delicious texture, strong narrative. I paused at a display of rose-petal jelly, my own contribution, and smiled when Karen Peterson, the new owner of Meadowbrook Farmy, beamed beside it. "It's delightful, Mrs. Mitchell," she said softly. "Thank you for sharing." I noted, "Exemplar of continuity, flavor profile immaculate." By lunchtime, the pavilion buzzed with chatter about genealogy, climate's impact on planting schedules, and trade tips for seeds. I took a break to sample a slice of rhubarb pie from Mrs. Alvarez, tangy sweet, with a crisp lattice crust, and felt the deep satisfaction of intergenerational exchange. In the afternoon, my judging pivoted to floral arrangements. A vase held sprigs of columbine and bleeding heart, their shapes like tiny dancers. Another featured sprigs of basil, an homage, I recognized, from a young widow who'd attended my seed-starting workshop. Each brought its own story: loss, renewal, hope. I scored based on cohesion and emotional resonance.
Finally, I assessed written narratives displayed alongside each entry. Typed pages recounting the journey of seeds across oceans, letters sewn into quilt squares telling of wartime gardens, and diary excerpts from resident childhoods spent barefoot in vegetable patches. My pen flew across the clipboard. Poignant, evocative, clarity of purpose. As judging concluded, Dorothy announced a brief ceremony. I stepped to the makeshift podium, a sturdy folding table draped in gingham, and shared my reflections. Each of these entries embodies stewardship and story. They remind us that seeds carry our histories, that flowers can tell our truths, and that a garden is more than plants. It's a living archive of who we are. Applause rippled through the crowd. I presented blue ribbons, one to the Vermont squash, one to the bandit potatoes, one to the basil arrangement, and one to the journal excerpts, the winners reflecting both heritage and heart. As I returned to my seat, the ribbon recipients offered heartfelt thanks, eyes shining with pride and connection. Later, back at home, I sat on the porch swing, ribbons laid across my lap like trophies of communal memory. Marcus and Jessica joined me, each carrying coffee from the clubhouse cafe. They'd volunteered to help clean up the pavilion, wanting to contribute genuinely rather than manage. Marcus nudged the basil ribbon toward his side. "I don't deserve this," he said quietly, voice thick. I placed my hand over his. "You do. You earned it by planting basil with honesty." Jessica sipped her coffee and sighed happily. "I've learned more about boundaries and legacy today than I ever did in that farmhouse." We sat together in companionable silence as the late afternoon sun softened the world. I gazed at the ribbons, then at the pond's rippling reflection. Each ribbon symbolized a story preserved, a community affirmed. In that moment, I felt the full circle of my journey. From sisterhood of chicken coops and sabotaged wells to a circle of neighbors united by seeds and stories. I realized that the strongest inheritance isn't land or money, but the shared narratives that bind us across time and place. As twilight painted the sky in lavender and rose, I folded the ribbons carefully into my journal, tucking them between the pages as mementos of this beautiful chapter. Tomorrow, I'd continue teaching pottery, guiding seedlings in the greenhouse, and building the foundation for Marcus and Jessica's new business. But tonight, I relished the knowledge that I'd crafted not just clay or contracts, but a living legacy of integrity, resilience, and community. The morning sun rose over whispering palms in soft lavender and rose hues, casting long shadows across the community gardens. I sipped my coffee on the porch swing, listening to the gentle hum of the air conditioner and the distant clink of trowels on watering cans. Today marked the official launch of Mitchell and Carter Sustainable Solutions, the consultancy Marcus and Jessica had built from scratch. I stood ready at the entrance to the greenhouse, eager to witness their first client meeting.
By mid-morning, a silver-haired couple pulled up in a rental truck laden with tools. They introduced themselves as Mr. and Mrs. Patel, no relation to Miss Patel, my financial planner, and explained that they'd recently purchased a small lot near the community center. "We want raised beds," Mrs. Patel said, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Accessible height, good drainage, heirloom seeds." Marcus stepped forward confidently, clipboard in hand. He greeted them warmly and led a brief site survey, measuring the sun exposure patterns and sketching potential layouts. Jessica hovered nearby, offering design suggestions: a drip irrigation system disguised beneath rustic trellises, pollinator-friendly companion plantings, and a small bench nook for restful breaks in the shade. I watched them from the edge of the patio, heart swelling with pride. A few months ago, they'd been scheming to seize my legacy. Now they were crafting someone else's dream, guided by service rather than self-interest. Their transformation felt profound, a testament to resilience and growth, not coercion. After the site walkthrough, we convened under the pavilion for refreshments. I'd baked lemon ginger scones and brewed black tea, plating them alongside jars of basil petal jelly. Neighbors mingled, praising the Patel's initiative. Dorothy approached and whispered, "Your children are doing remarkable work, an inspiration for all of us." I smiled and touched her arm. They learned from the best. As Marcus and Jessica answered questions about soil amendments and seed varietals, I slipped away to the potting bench where I found my next ceramic project waiting. Planters shaped like scalloped shells, designed to hold windowsill microgreens. I wedged the clay with rhythmic pressure, my mind reflecting on how the consultancy's success hinged on empathy and expertise, qualities they honed through community engagement and honest effort.
The consultation wrapped up by mid-afternoon with signed contracts and handshake farewells. The Patels promised to send photos as soon as the beds were installed, and Marcus offered to lead a follow-up workshop on composting. As they drove away, I joined my children for a celebratory lunch at the Clubhouse Cafe. Fresh salads made from community garden produce and iced spearmint lemonade. Between bites, Jessica leaned forward. "Mom, thank you for trusting us with your legacy and giving us the chance to find our own path." She paused, emotion catching in her throat. I never imagined I'd feel this proud to build something outside of real estate commissions. Marcus nodded. "We wouldn't be here without your guidance, but now it's ours." I reached across the table and clasped their hands. "This is your inheritance of character, service, integrity, stewardship. Use it well." After lunch, I returned to the pottery studio to finish glazing the scalloped planters. Each swirl of glaze reminded me of the cycles of growth: seed to sprout, clay to vessel, challenge to triumph. I loaded the kiln and set the timer, filling the studio with the comforting promise of transformation. Later, I walked through the garden paths toward the Lakeview gazebo, where a group of neighbors rehearsed for the spring concert. Laughter and guitar chords mingled with bird calls. I paused, inhaling the scent of honeysuckle and jasmine, feeling the gentle tug of belonging. This community had woven me into its tapestry of shared purpose, resilience, and renewal. Back at home, I found a package on the doorstep, a leather-bound photo album from Marcus and Jessica. Inside were snapshots of the consultancy's first projects, raised beds in progress, smiling clients, and candid moments of us planting daffodil bulbs together. They left blank pages at the end labeled "Future Stories." I flipped through the memories and felt tears prick my eyes, tears of joy, relief, and enduring love. I closed the album and set it on the coffee table where the porcelain garden fairy perched nearby, still watching over me. As dusk settled, I prepared a light supper of basil-infused pasta and garden salad. I ate slowly, mindful of each fresh leaf's crispness and each herb's bright note. Tomorrow, I would host my first pottery class here in Florida, guiding residents to shape clay and stories alike. Before bed, I climbed the stairs to my bedroom and gazed at the wedding invitation, taped to the wall beside my dresser. A symbol of beginnings, persistence, and partnership. I whispered a thanks to Frank, to Marcus, to Jessica, and to the land that shaped us all. I drifted to sleep, knowing that part 14 of my story, one of reconciliation through service, had drawn to a close, and that part 15, with its final reflections and farewells, awaited in the dawn. The dawn chorus greeted me with song as I poured the last of my tea onto the basil sprigs waiting on the windowsill. Today was the day I would gather all my journals, ribbons, and keepsakes for one final reflection before formally closing this chapter. I dressed in a simple linen blouse and walked to the community pavilion where neighbors were setting up folding chairs in a semicircle facing the pond. Dorothy approached, smiling. "Ready for your closing address?" I nodded, stepping onto the small wooden platform erected beside the water. The morning light shimmered on the rippling surface, reflecting a tapestry of butterflies and blooms. I felt a hush of anticipation. "Friends," I began, voice steady, "we've shared seasons of growth, renewal, and resilience together. You've welcomed me, taught me, and given me purpose again." I held up the leather-bound photo album Marcus and Jessica gifted me. Within these pages are memories of our journey, from a farmhouse lost to a community found, from family strife to partnerships born of service. I flipped to the last blank pages. Here lies the space for future stories, stories you will shape, just as I have shaped clay and gardens beside you. I paused, letting the pond's tranquility flow through me. I reached into my pocket and drew the brass key to my Florida cottage. This key unlocks my home, but it also symbolizes trust. I handed it to Dorothy, who accepted it with gentle reverence. I entrust this place to our community garden club, so long as they honor its spirit of stewardship, sharing, and collaboration. Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. I returned to my seat, noticing Marcus and Jessica wiping away tears. I drew a deep breath. In closing, I continued, I leave you with 3 gifts. A ribbon of basil as a reminder that character grows from honest effort. A bowl of clay as a symbol that we can reshape our lives. And a memory of this pond where each ripple echoes the power of community. I placed a small ceramic bowl, fresh from the kiln, on the podium. Inside was a single basil leaf resting on a ribbon. I stepped down and walked among the residents seated, offering hugs, handshakes, and whispered thanks. Each person who took the bowl promised to pass it to someone else in the community when they'd added their own basil leaf, a living token of our shared journey. When the crowd had dispersed, I returned home to pack my final box. My grandfather's tools, the last blooms pressing between journal pages, and the wedding invitation, destined for the guest bedroom nightstand. I taped the door shut, hung a small sign reading, "On to New Beginnings," and clipped the key ring to the latch. Standing on the porch, I inhaled deeply, tasting freedom and fulfillment. My life had been a series of seasons, planting, pruning, harvest, rest. And now came a time of migration, like birds heading south for winter. I looked once more at the pond, its surface calm and infinite. Soon I'd move to Naples proper, to a smaller apartment overlooking the Gulf, where I'd teach pottery, lead garden workshops, and share stories with visitors. My belongings fit in one carload, my memories in an album and a bowl. With a final nod to the place that had healed me, I took the key and slipped it into my pocket. I closed the door behind me, the hush of the pavilion and the hum of cicadas, my farewell chorus. As I walked down the path toward morning's promise, I whispered to the wind, "Thank you for every lesson, every bloom, every ripple." And in that quiet breath, I felt the promise of new soil ready for planting, new clay eager for shaping, and a heart wide open to whatever story came next.
Looking back on the journey from Meadowbrook Farm to Whispering Palms, I've come to understand that home is not defined by acreage or property value, but by the stories we share and the relationships we cultivate. I endured loss and betrayal, fought to reclaim my boundaries and independence, and ultimately learned that the most valuable inheritance isn't money, it's integrity, compassion, and service. Letting go of the farm was more than relinquishing a place. It was freeing myself from the weight of others' expectations and manipulations. I entrusted its legacy to those who would honor its history, and I watched Marcus and Jessica embrace the challenge of building their own lives, earning success through honest effort. In doing so, they discovered the power of clear boundaries and learned that character is the richest inheritance of all. At Whispering Palms, I found a true community. Neighbors who tend their gardens side by side, shape clay on the pottery wheel together, and preserve one another's stories through basil tokens, ribbons, and handcrafted bowls. Here, companionship and shared purpose have replaced the loneliness and helplessness I once felt. Together, we celebrate each seedling's growth and each potter's creation, knowing that every act of care leaves a lasting ripple. Now, as the farm's key rests in a keepsake box, I carry forward gratitude, wisdom, and freedom. I will continue planting seeds, both literal and metaphorical, teaching mud pottery classes and telling stories that inspire resilience and hope. Life unfolds in seasons, and with spring on the horizon, I eagerly anticipate new beginnings, fresh ideas to sow, new friendships to nurture, and another chapter filled with growth, renewal, and the enduring strength of a community rooted in love and respect.